Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. We now continue our special series presented by Benita Parker of the West Wallsend District Heritage Group, sharing the lives of the pioneering women of West Wallsend. In part 1, Mary Johnston took us from her childhood in Somerset to the hardships of early settlement in the bush. Now, in part 2, you'll step further into her world, a time of growing family, opportunity and change, where a miner's wife becomes the matriarch of a bustling household and a small settlement transforms into a thriving town. From the building of the famous Museum Hotel to the triumphs and tragedies of family life, Mary's story continues.
My name is Mary Johnston. Welcome to part 2 of my life journey as a pioneer in West Wallsend district back in the late 1800s. I'd like to pick up my story after William and I had been married almost 20 years, in about 1880. And he had been fortunate enough to be able to cease working in the mines as a result of smart advice from a well-placed friend by the name of James Fletcher, whose name I'm sure some of you will know. We now had a family of 10 children, so let me reflect on our family for a moment. By 1882, our eldest son, young James, was 18 years old and a great help to his father. As I was still childbearing and caring for this ever-increasing family, I really didn't pay much attention to what the men were doing until after Edward was born in 1885. When he was born, I still wasn't even 40 years old, and I was a mother of 11 demanding children. The very next year, in 1886, James, our eldest, married Catherine Sinclair, and they soon had their first child. I was a grandmother before I turned 40. They went on to have another 5 children. I was so proud of James, and I would love to sit down and tell you his story, but time doesn't allow now, but maybe later. When the West Wallsend mine was near opening in 1887, imagine what a surprise I received when William told me that he had bought land in the new town and he was going to build a hotel near the mine. Of course, I had experience in the hotel business before I was married, and we had a large family to help, so the plan became a reality. What a wonderful day it was when William took us all up to the site and announced, "Mother, I once promised you a beautiful castle for a home. Here it is." And wasn't it beautiful? William, the boys and the builder had created a huge 14-room, 2-storey brick hotel where we could all live in comfort, along with paying guests and a bar. And it was located directly opposite the new mine and across the road from the railway station. That day, I do remember, I had tears in my eyes. We moved into our new hotel the same year the mine opened in 1888. From the first moment we opened our doors to trade, we were so busy. In fact, William had no sooner finished the build than he decided it wasn't big enough and had a huge 2-storey extension built at the rear of the hotel. The extension had 6 accommodation rooms and a large dance hall upstairs and 3 shops and meeting rooms downstairs. As if that wasn't enough, William started a coach service daily from the front door of the hotel to Cockle Creek railway station to meet the morning and evening train that ran from Sydney to Newcastle. This was also the year my father died, in 1888. He was buried at Sandgate Cemetery. He had been born in a little English village, migrated to Australia, and became a coal miner for all his life. He worked hard and was looking forward to retirement and helping William and me in the hotel. Sadly, that didn't happen. However, my mother, Betsy, now a great-grandmother, moved to live with us. She spent the last 10 years of her life with us and the extended family, caring for grandchildren and great-grandchildren until she died in 1899. Well, of course, West Wallsend would not have come into existence if it hadn't been for the West Wallsend Coal Company and its mine, right here where the town now sits and where William built our beautiful hotel. The coal company constructed its own private railway from West Wallsend to a junction with the main line near Cockle Creek, and it opened in time to move the first ton of coal from the mine to the wharf in Newcastle in July 1888. All of us who lived in the new little town were so excited. This line was used for passengers as well, and we could go into Wallsend or even Newcastle on a day trip. The railway was in service from May 1888 until the 31st of January 1930, long after both William and I were no longer there to enjoy it. All the time we lived in town, the railway terminated at the little station, more or less at our front door. The tram was a different story. It didn't come to town for us until after William had died. It came about because the townspeople wanted a cleaner, more reliable way to get into Wallsend and then on to Newcastle. I remember some of the many meetings that were held to try to convince the government of our need. It took years of battling the authorities, but eventually the town was rewarded with a clean, regular service via Young Wallsend and into town. The steam tram was started in November 1910. I forgot to tell you that we named our wonderful new hotel the Museum Hotel. This was to honour the amazing work of our eldest surviving daughter, Margaret, whom we all called Maggie. From infancy, Maggie had a fascination with all things from nature. She gathered feathers, bugs, and even dead animals and hid them in places we generally only found through the smell. Her father had learnt a little about the art of taxidermy back home in Scotland, and he taught her what he knew. She was gifted and was, from the age of about 8, creating a world of stuffed animals, birds and reptiles. But she preferred birds. We, that is, William and James, made glass showcases in which to display her work, and we placed them all through our museum hotel. Word spread and people would come from miles away to look at her work. The very best showcase of her work was one the men built at the top of the stairs in the extension. It had owls and magpies, mudlarks and parrots, finches and lizards, and so many other birds it's hard for me to recall. I do remember, though, that whenever I was missing her presence, after she and her new husband went to Sydney to live, I would go and stand at the foot of the stairs and then slowly walk up, step by step, until only the glass separated me from her wonderful works. In the end, we had in excess of 100 creatures on show throughout the hotel. The best of all her creations, I think, was her stuffed lyrebird. She somehow managed to capture this beautiful bird in full mating performance with his tail standing up like its namesake, the lyre, and wings extended as it danced on its mating mound. The only thing missing was its wonderful mimicry, an unreal trilling one could only hear in the bush. For that, we would have needed some modern gadgetry that hadn't even been invented yet. When Maggie got married in 1893, she and her husband, a mines engineer, moved to Sydney, and sadly, Margaret gave up her taxidermy work. She'd even entered her work in the big Minmi show in 1891 and won all the prizes. She wasn't very popular among some of the men who competed against her. I became a grandmother to Margaret's 2 sweet little girls. I should mention that Maggie's husband, Mr. John Humphrey, who came from Scotland, was the first young engineer employed by the West Wallsend mine, just across the road from us, and he lived with us in the hotel. That's where Maggie met him and fell in love. Charles, our second son, decided he didn't like hotel life and wanted to travel the world. He got as far as New Zealand, where he met a local lass, married and spent the rest of his life. I'm really proud of all my children, but just don't have the time to tell you about the adult life of each. Thomas became a policeman, and the remaining children married locally and stayed in the district, apart from Alexander. It breaks my heart to tell you about Alexander. In 1896 he was just 22 and a wonderful help in the hotel, and also was quite famous locally as a footballer. On Friday afternoon they'd go down to the Oval, named after William, Johnston Oval, to train for the match the next day. This day was just a normal day, so after training he came home, had his dinner, helped in the hotel until closing before going up to his room to sleep. Next morning he came staggering into our bedroom in terrible pain and coughing in a heart-wrenching manner. William jumped out of bed and ran to the room in the accommodation wing where Dr. James Hocken was one of our boarders. By the time they got back to our bedroom, Alexander had passed away, and the doctor said there was nothing he could have done for him, as it was his heart. His funeral was one of the largest the town had ever seen, and he was laid to rest in our new West Wallsend cemetery. For the remainder of my life, I took flowers to his grave each week. I remember life in the hotel was always busy, and the bar was always full of miners, timber cutters and others. Noise and raucous laughter always filled the room, but that was just the men letting off steam after a hard day's work in the bush or the mine. One day there was a young fellow in the bar when I was behind the counter. He was loud and foul-mouthed and was generally annoying everyone. It must have been a day I had a headache or was in a bad mood. So when I could stand it no longer, I lifted the flap of the counter, walked out to where he was standing, grabbed him by his dirty shirt collar and dragged him to the front door. Yes, I no longer was that petite young lass from years ago, but a good solid matron with muscle to match. Everyone, including the young fellow, was so shocked when I raised my voice and told him in no uncertain terms to get out of my hotel and stay out until he learnt how to behave. After a moment's silence, the men cheered and shouted, "Good on you, missus." I retreated behind the bar feeling a bit embarrassed, but I never had a problem after that. My William never seemed to stop, and before we really thought about it, he'd turned 73 in the year 1900. We decided it was time to retire. Of course, William had prepared for that too. In 1887, he'd purchased lots 1 and 2 in Wilson Street, only 2 doors down from the hotel. On one he had built a tennis court, but on the other he had built my 3rd castle, and this time it was just for us. In later years it was number 74 Wilson Street, but in our day it was just Johnston's place. It was magnificent, and William had spared nothing to make it a real home. There was a veranda all the way around the house, and this is where William, in his retirement, spent much of his time. He could sit in his big easy chair and watch what was happening all around him. He could see all the comings and goings at the hotel. He could see the trains laden with coal and passengers as they chugged to Cockle Creek and back. He could see his sports oval, where Alexander and all his mates had played football, and he could see his family as they came to visit and share a meal. My kitchen was everything I could have dreamed of and never imagined when I was first married at 17. It had an immense stove that would, at a pinch, take a whole roasting pig. The ceilings were 14 feet or nearly 5 metres high throughout the house. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and there was a living room and 5 large bedrooms down the hallway. The hallway itself was about 8 foot wide, that's 2.5 metres, and 30 foot or 10 metres long. It was a grand home and my true castle. Although we had everything that was modern at the time it was built, we still had to go outside to the bathhouse, laundry, and the toilet was still up the backyard. When we retired, only the younger children were still at home, but the others were frequent visitors. Poor William's health deteriorated fairly rapidly after he retired, and in August 1904, aged 77, he passed away. What a sad day that was for our family and for the whole town. It was a huge funeral, and he was laid to rest beside our Alexander in our local cemetery. I owed this man so much for the life he had given me that I made sure his coffin was of polished cedar and heavily silver-mounted, made by his son James, and one he could be proud of. That was the least I could do for him. So much was happening in West Wallsend over these years. The townspeople opened a cooperative store in 1891, which was very successful, and the government opened a school the same year. At first, there were only about 50 students, but by 1900 there were over 400. A beautiful School of Arts building opened in 1902, just up in what had now become the main street. And I'm allowed to boast that it too was built by my James. They called the main street Carrington Street after the man who was Governor of New South Wales at that time, but for many years it had been known as Minmi Road. All our streets were named after important people, mostly associated with the mine, like Laidley, Wilson, Brooks and Withers, to name just a few. As soon as land came on the market, it was snapped up and all the miners built lovely homes for their families. Fancy big brick churches and lodge buildings were the centre of much of our social life, although we didn't really have time for a social life away from the hotel. These structures were built for and by the people, most of them lovely buildings which would be there long after the founders were gone to rest. The West Wallsend Cooperative Store, as it was known, provided almost all necessities anyone could need. It was very successful and expanding all the time, from the tiny little rented shop in 1891 to the most impressive brick buildings that graced Withers Street in the 1900s. Eventually, services such as water, electricity and sewerage came to town. Yes, our West Wallsend was the place to live. The town was exploding with energy and vigour, growing into an important place. My James had become a builder and contractor and had built himself a magnificent, big, 2-storey home right next to where the new post office was built in 1906 in Carrington Street. Part of his home was a showroom and a workshop where he made and sold items, including coffins, because, you see, he also became an undertaker. He also became very well respected in the town and was mayor of Lake Macquarie on 3 separate occasions. And when he died in 1933, he was still mayor. He was one of the first men in town to own a car, and everyone wanted to hire it for their weddings or funerals. Yes, James and Kate were just as busy in their lives as William and I had been over the years. James was patron and president of many sporting groups and community organisations, such as Vice President of West Wallsend School of Arts, President of West Wallsend Cemetery Trust, etc. Mark was one of my younger children, born in 1879. He married the year we retired, and William Jr. and his sister Janet married the next year in 1901. All the family, apart from my baby Edward, were married while their father was still alive to give them his blessing. Edward married in 1909 and went to live in Cessnock. So many changes were happening in the town of West Wallsend. When we arrived and built the hotel, basically there was no town at all, but maybe 40 or 50 houses. By 1900, when William retired, the place was a bustling town of nearly 5,000 people, with not only West Wallsend mine in operation, but 2 or 3 other ones close by, such as Monkwearmouth, which later became Seam No. 1, and Killingworth. Mark and his sister, Mary Helen, both married into the same family named Reichardt, a well-known local family here in West Wallsend. Mark married Emily Alice Reichardt in 1900, and Mary Helen married Alfred Reichardt in June 1904. Mary and Alfred had 2 sons, both born in West Wallsend, so I got to see them and cuddle them. Then in 1914, World War I thundered into our lives, and all the young men had to make the decision whether to fight for their country or stay at home and try to provide the needs of war. Everyone in the community was affected either by the mine closures, staff shortages, or members of their family enlisting. 2 of my sons, William, named after his father, and Mark, enlisted and were sent overseas. Both of them were married and had to leave their wives and children behind them. As a result of the war, the whole town and the mines suffered from loss of the strong workforce. Conditions were hard, and all the mothers, like me, who had sons at war, waited in fear and trepidation for the dreaded knock on the door and the delivery of the telegram carrying news, mostly sad, to their loved ones. After William had died and the girls had married, I was alone in my beautiful big home, waiting for something to happen, a family member to visit, or that dreaded telegram. It all took a toll on my health, and in 1918, before my boys came home, I died. My remains were laid to rest beside those of my William and Alexander. I had lived a full and mostly contented life, from my birth in a small village in Somerset in England to the wilds of Apple Tree Flat in the colony of New South Wales. I had married at 17 and lived in my first castle until, after giving birth to a family of 12 children, we moved to my second castle in the Museum Hotel, before eventually finding rest in retirement in my final castle, Johnston's Place in West Wallsend.
You've been listening to part 2 of the life story of Mary Johnston, a pioneer of West Wallsend. Through her story, we've witnessed the growth of a family, the rise of a town, and the resilience required to face both success and sorrow in colonial New South Wales. From the bustling days of the Museum Hotel to the quiet reflections of her later years, Mary's story reminds us that history is not just made of events, but of lives lived, loved and remembered. This series is presented by Benita Parker of the West Wallsend District Heritage Group, preserving the stories that shaped our communities. Join Benita next time as she brings you more first-person stories of the remarkable women who helped build and shape the district of West Wallsend on Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.